He's definitely brutal. He's always savage, and you're definitely getting wrecked.
When you play fantasy esports, esports pools, you can get some sense of what it's like to be an owner, but without a lot of the same costs. You pick the players that represent you, you cheer for them, depending on how well it goes. Next time, you pick a different player, you don't have to worry about sticking with the same roster. There are even certain contests that are free to enter. You don't have to invest anything yourself, but you can still somehow profit or win from the success of the team of players you picked within the salary cap. Obviously, there is no salary cap for real teams, which is one of the problems that owners run into, as we'll get into. Also, if you bet with esports pools, you can also have the feeling of cheering for a team and pulling for them and then being your team. And then if they happen to win the match, you win and you reward when all you had to invest was the cost of the bet of your side of the wager. You don't have to invest salary and space to practice and a coach and then send them to the tournaments and then put up with players, wanting all the prize money back and not being able to get any revenue share yourself. You just make the profit of whatever the odds were if you happen to win. Now, the esports ecosystem has led to a scenario where a lot of owners of organizations are pretty fucked when it comes to trying to make money. They are in one of the toughest spots of anyone within the ecosystem. Now, particularly in CSGO, they are utterly fucked at the moment. But this applies to games like League of Legends, hence why the North American owners pushed to have the NALCS become franchised, hence why these EULCS owners either think it's just a lost battle and it's hopeless that they're going to be able to make any kind of good money or be able to be the top teams and make any money, or they're trying to demand that Riot applies some sort of franchising or revenue sharing in Europe for similar reasons that I'm going to lay out here, but more league specific. But I'm going to generally look at this from the CSGO side of things, but a lot of the aspects will apply. So within the esports ecosystem, there are three main branches you need to think about, and others which only connect in through those three main branches. So there are tournament organizers. So we're now talking about Riot Games, not to be confused with their role as a game developer. We're talking about when they run the LCS. We're talking about MLG. We're talking about ESL, DreamHack, StarLadder, PGL. These are all tournament organizers who put on tournaments, who host leagues, and they need teams to compete in them, and then those teams need players to have teams to field to compete in these tournaments. There's the basic ecosystem. So tournament organizers, they start the tournament. They're the top part of the pyramid. Then you go to the next part, it's the organizations. By organizations, I mean teams, but I'm saying organizations to make it less confusing, because by team, we sometimes use that to refer to just the 5 players who play, say, CSGO within an organization. So organizations, we're talking about Cloud9 and Fnatic and TSM and Astralis. These are the organizations. This is the company which hires the players to play for them to then compete in the leagues and the tournaments which the tournament organizers run. Then we've got the last branch, the last layer of the pyramid, the bottom one, which in theory is the players, the professional players who compete for the Cloud9s, the Fnatics, the TSMs of the world, who compete within those teams and then for those teams in tournaments such as those organized by Riot Games, ESL, StarLadder, etc. Now, along the way, we get money injected into the scene for those 3 different categories, which come largely from 2 different areas. There's sponsors, so they're investing into tournaments, sponsoring tournaments, and they're also sponsoring the organizations. And then we have fans, and they pay money through various revenue streams to tournament organizers and to organizations. Now, what's funny is you look at that ecosystem right there, and you would immediately say, right, well, I see the ecosystem and the way you framed it, you know, players are at the bottom. They are needed in all these areas, but the deals that are really important are done above their heads. They don't have a lot of control and say in it. Also, when you mentioned the money coming into the scene, you didn't mention any of it going straight to the players. And yeah, you're right. The money initially goes to tournament organizers and goes to the organizations and then comes from those 2 upper categories, upper fields, to the bottom field, which is the player. So that might make it seem like, well, there's an obvious natural imbalance in the scene where the tournament organizers and the organizations could keep most of the money and pay the players the bare minimum, which was the case at certain times in history and is why there was abuse of players' positions and they had an inability to leverage themselves, especially when they acted in isolation in the past. And that's why for a lot of esports history, yes, it's understandable that players were the ones getting the short end of the stick and we're getting screwed over. But let's look at the modern day esports scenario. So first of all, tournament organizers, the ESLs, the DreamHacks of the world, the Riot Games, they don't get a lot of sympathy, I have to say. They tend to get blamed for everything that goes wrong in any context with their tournaments. Their role is often misunderstood. They can actually get fucked over by game developers quite often with things that they had no say over. They can have technical issues occur which are beyond their control and could happen to anyone, but it's treated as though it was entirely their fault. Now you go down and you look at players. Now, players traditionally did get screwed over in some senses or didn't get anywhere close to their value. They didn't make much money in the past relative to everyone else in the scene and relative to other competitive disciplines and especially traditional sports. But actually, currently, organizations, so the teams in esports, are now, in my opinion, the most hard done by of the three groups in esports in terms of not getting any sympathy, no one really caring about their plight, people essentially kind of telling them, like, stop whining if they have big problems that they want to have addressed, and yet they are the ones that, in theory, have some of the hardest times making revenue, making money back, to justify their big investment into the scene, and yet they are a vital component within the scene. If we didn't need organizations, then players wouldn't play for organizations. They'd go straight into tournaments, and tournament organizers would deal directly with players, and there'd be no need for organizations in the middle. But we absolutely do need organizations. So the real question we need to ask to really understand why the organizations are being so hard done by, and yet why people don't seem to appreciate the dynamic that allows that to happen, is how do people actually make money in esports? Now, when I say make money, I mean make revenue. I don't necessarily mean make a profit. That's a different matter entirely. But how do you make money in the first place before you put it against your expenses and all the costs and figure out if you've actually earned a profit? So the tournament organizers have big sponsors. So the Intel Extreme Masters for ESL, sponsored by Intel. I mean, technically, I believe they actually own part of that, but obviously that's a good example. Generally, Asus tournaments, likewise, might be run sometimes by third parties, but they might be sponsored by Asus. We have these big sponsors who come in and they sponsor the events. Sponsorship now is huge for these events. We can sometimes be talking millions of dollars for deals. Then we have ticket sales. So we know a lot of big event organizers now host their events in big stadiums. They don't do studio events anymore. So even though the majority of the audience is online, they're getting thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people to come to their live event and pay tickets to go and see those matches. If it says there's 8,000 at a big American event, that's probably 8,000 people paid for tickets. It's not like when they first started the Katowice events in EMS and IEM back in like 2014 or whatever it was. That would have been like 2013 actually. It wasn't like back then when, and in fact to this day at the Katowice events, where they let a lot of people in for free. No, other big stadiums are being filled up by people who pay, and when they're not being filled up, that's why, because people wouldn't pay for those tickets. So there's a lot of money coming in now from that. Nothing close to traditional sports, but still there is now revenue to be earned from that regard. Getting very respectable. Then you've got to consider the selling broadcast rights. So we know ESL Pro League, ECS, these are tournaments which sold the broadcast rights to YouTube. So instead of just being on Twitch and getting the benefits of being on Twitch, they sold for millions to YouTube, and now they got paid millions to have their league broadcast. So that's now money that the tournament organizers earning directly. Despite the fact that tournament organizer, yes, they put on the whole league and envision it all, but without the teams and then without the players in those teams, they don't have a product to sell to the person who's giving them the broadcast rights. And those broadcast rights are worth millions. Then we have merchandising. So you sell either your own gear, ESL hats, ESL shirts, or you make a deal with the teams and they sell their merchandise via your event. So you get a cut of the profit when they sell a Cloud9 jersey or they sell a jersey for Astralis. Finally, you have crowdfunding where fans directly can support events, which admittedly only happens in certain instances and is not very common in CSGO. It was mainly Dota 2, which pioneered that and still to this day has a large element component within it. But also you do have in League of Legends like selling icons and whatnot and teams getting part of it and the developer getting part of it, although in this case they're the tournament organizer. Now, tournament organizers have a lot of ways to make money, as you can see there. And whether they make profit, yes, is directly going to be largely dictated to by how much they feel they have to invest and put on a massive spectacle, have a huge show to make their event big enough relative to the rest of the peers within their group. Now you look at the players. So the players make salary. And at the moment, those salaries are huge. They are inflated well beyond anything, at least for the top teams, that could be made back in terms of money and profit and revenue by their teams. It's way too high, and that is because of investment coming into teams who then don't run their organization like a business. They just try to pay the highest salaries to get the best players and therefore be among the best teams and have a prime position within the industry. They're not worried right now about making all the money back, and they're willing to go even higher when the actual margins don't merit it. And so salaries for players are incredibly huge, bigger than they actually should be based on where the industry is at, especially in CSGO, but also in League of Legends for top players. Now, players also make money from prize money. Now, in most cases, most top players in orgs you can think of make practically all of the prize money. So when players want to go to tournaments and they only want to focus on tournaments and they don't want to do many sponsor obligations, they just want to go to as many tournaments as they can and play in as many competitions and play in online leagues, then that actually is because they want to get the prize money, because that's a way, they're already getting their salary for playing for the team, but this is a way they can directly make more money, is by going and winning more prize money, by competing in tournaments, getting placings that earn you prize money, and then that money is largely going to the players again. So the players are making pretty good money right now because there's lots of prize money out there in a game like CSGO that they're benefiting from. And nowadays, the split between the org and the teams is very, very slim due to competition, where if other people are saying, well, we'll only take 5-10% of your prize money, then it's hard for you to make a deal with a team if you want to take 30% of their prize money. Most people have been whittled down, having to pay a very little, and the teams are getting 90% of the prize money, etc. Sometimes 100%. Then you've got to go and look. Players make money in CSGO from sticker money, which again, they're getting most of. When sticker money first started, there was even splits, or there was orgs making more because they'd balanced out the deal that way. Now, again, due to the massive investment and due to people coming in and not running their organization like a business and needing to make money, they're willing to give up so much more of this to the players to make their offer to the players even more enticing and ensure that they get the players they want and they get the best players. And so again, sticker money is a way players are making money and they're making most of the money. Now you go and look at organizations. So we've talked about how the tournament organizers, how the players make money, but how does the middle tier, how do the organizations, which are a vital middle ground between the tournament organizers that put on the competition and the players that want to play in the competition but need an organization to represent, to be part of that tournament? So here's the problem. Organizers make money from sponsors. So to make their money from sponsors, they need exposure, because the sponsor is paying for a certain amount of eyeballs and a certain demographic of eyeballs to look at their product and to become aware of their product and be exposed to their product. So what they need is, first of all, they need raw man hours. So they need things like players streaming. They need to have access to players to make marketing tools, so obligations for photo shoots, content with the sponsors. They need other hours within the org context that fans are watching, loyal fans of the team. So they need content that the team makes, which is vlogs and reality series and interviews and articles, so that again, even without having to win a match, eyeballs are on the team and the sponsors are right there in the picture and being mentioned so that they're getting more exposure. And they need the players to compete in big competitions, which is where the fans watch them, so they need them compete in online leagues and offline tournaments. And you need all these aspects to make the sponsors happy to get the highest sponsor amounts. So sponsorship, that sounds good so far, right? Yeah, let's keep going. Then orgs can make money through merchandise. Now, first of all, as I referenced before, where you sell the merchandise from, not that many people necessarily buy the jersey from online shops and give the money directly to a team like Cloud9. A lot of people wait till they go to the big LAN tournament, like an ESL 1, and they buy it from the shop there. That's where they do the impulse buy of a jersey, or they've come there and they thought, well, I'm a Cloud9 fan, I don't have a jersey. Oh, you can buy one there. They buy one that, or they just happen to see it there, and therefore it's in their mind. And so often you have to share the merchandising with those people, and it's still not like that's at the level of like football jerseys in England, for example, where you make millions and millions and millions just from the jersey. No. So you make a bit from merchandising, but not a massive, overwhelming amount. And if you ever look into merchandising, like making t-shirts or jerseys, your margins for profit are not super high. Like, as much as it seems ridiculous, like, bloody hell, $30 for a jersey, go and have a look how much you actually make per jersey, and you might be shocked by some of the margins. They're not just making like half or more of that back just in pure profit. That's absolutely ridiculous, because, by the way, if that was the case, then you'd be in a scenario where you could just price your jerseys to be less than the other guy and completely wreck him in scenarios where people are fans of multiple teams. Now, it's worth pointing out, those are really the only ways that the orgs make money. Like, yeah, maybe they make a bit through crowdfunding when people buy icons and things like that and stickers. Okay, a bit. Do they make a bit through prize money? Yeah, they make a little bit, but as I said already, players make the majority of that. Do they make anything through broadcast rights? Okay, in some leagues, they've started to make some, such as ECS, EPL, but we don't really know the numbers. In other tournaments that they compete, as far as we know, they don't make anything. They don't make anything from competing in a massive tier 1 LAN that doesn't have an online league. They don't make anything from competing in a major beyond some of the sticker money that they make. They don't make any revenue share of that. Like, they're not actually getting the broadcast rights, which in theory, one day, by the way, the two areas that will be the biggest money makers is broadcast rights and then is fan paying for stuff through merchandising or ticket sales. So unless you can get a percentage of that, not only right now you're not making much, but you're not going to make much in the future, where others are going to be incredibly rich and make massive amounts of revenue and profit from those areas. And yet at the moment, you're not even angled to get those things in CSGO. So right now, CSGO organizations don't make much money. They don't get rev share generally from leagues. And yet, they provide the teams, the top teams, that those tournament organizers need to run those huge events with lots of fans online and in person who specifically want to see those teams, top teams, and their own fan favorite team. And yet they don't get much of the revenue in that sense. They don't get prize money because, as I said, typically nearly all goes to players, if not all now, as part of having to be competitive with other people's offers, which sometimes are based on funding, which is actually unreasonable in a business sense. They also massively suffer because their main way of making money, as I said, is through sponsorship. And they massively suffer because they can't actually provide for their sponsors what they otherwise should be able to due to players and tournaments. So tournament organizers don't give a fuck about whether orgs make money generally, especially not in the context of whether the tournament organizer makes money, because tournament organizers want to fill up the calendar with as many leagues and as many tournaments as they can, and then they want the best and the biggest teams to attend so that they can make lots of revenue and sell merchandising, etc. And so they're willing to fill up the whole calendar. Well, when the whole calendar's filled up and a top team doesn't have time for streaming hours and sponsor obligations and creating extra content, then yes, the team will have some exposure by competing in those tournaments, but they're not going to make as much as they might otherwise with some of the other ways that they can meet their sponsor obligations in a more direct sense than just wearing the jersey and competing in the tournament. Then you go and look, and pro players generally don't really care about the orgs in this sense either, because pro players sometimes only want to focus on the matches, or if they're doing well, they say, oh, I don't want to take time out to do a photo shoot and come to the studio and do these other things here. I'll do some secondary content. Like, we're busy practicing for this big tournament. And you know what? We want to attend another tournament next month, even though we've got quite a packed schedule because we think we can do well, even if that means missing out on some sponsor obligations. Oh, we don't want to just stream and play for fun and have all the branding there. We want to just practice for official matches. And so as a result, the streaming hours and the sponsors, what are the sponsor obligations and the hours which you can sell to sponsors are getting reduced because pro players who already get all their money from the salary and from the prize money, they don't see an obvious incentive to helping out in this regard, and therefore they're putting their orgs in a position where their org can't make as much money. Again, the orgs have to cede some of the control in this sense and agree to these demands because of these offers coming from other people and having to try and be competitive if you want the best or the biggest name players. Now, this largely happened in CSGO around 2015 onwards, when CSGO itself was kind of growing and really blowing up year on year on year, and the major system was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because now you had these salary increases that weren't just within the scene being very, very competitive, but they were coming from outside. So you had these big salary increases that were every 3 months, they were almost like 1.5 times to doubling what they were before. Then you had prize money percentage increase, where now, as people signed new contracts, they also were demanding more the prize money, less of a share, less of a split, and more just going more towards the players. So again, that was the way you had to be competitive to give a very good prize money percent. Then you had sticker money percentage increase. As I said earlier on, you didn't have to have all the sticker money going to the players, because guess what? The sticker is actually the logo of the team, the organization, and so they were getting a percentage of it, and they are the ones funding you to be in the tournament in the first place to be able to do that. And yes, you play and you're being good allows them to get there, but it's both. It's not one or the other, is it? So sticker money percentage increase, because again, that also became a factor within these negotiated deals. And if you hear that a team, like at the time, a team like a G2, Kingwin, a FaZe is getting a lot more sticker percentage money, and you're a team that's much better than them in tournaments, you say, what the fuck? We're better than them. Why aren't we getting that percentage? And then you go demand that of your org next time you re-up. Now, it wasn't just an internal battle, because there was this investment coming from outside. So in CSGO, we're talking about Refresh, eSforce, FC Copenhagen investing into North. These are people who are willing to pay salaries which are too high even for them to make money back. It's not that they've figured out the business and they can make good revenue off this and the others are just idiots who don't know business. No, they're willing to pay a lot more than they're bringing in. They're willing to give players basically everything. So all those other areas you could have made at least some money back from your teams, they're willing to give up most of these to the players to make the deal even sweeter for them. They're gambling on leveraging their position right now so that in the future, they're in a spot where when those huge revenue shares come in from broadcast rights or merchandising and ticket sales, they will be in position to make that money because they'll still be among the biggest organizations, because they'll have franchise spots or revenue share deals in place in these leagues, or in some cases, they might even have their own league, which they already own some of the teams to make up half the league, and therefore they can make a lot more of the money directly by being the tournament organizer and the owner of the team until some game dev actually goes ahead and makes that fucking illegal, which apparently they're not going to do. Now, the question here is what happens to traditional organizations? Well, first and foremost, at the current rate of inflation in all these areas and deals whittling down the margins to make money as an org so viciously, you have to basically fall in line with what those people who are winning out in these deals are doing. You have to sell out some equity in your team, get investment in like those organizations, and likewise gamble that you will, by staying afloat and being near the top now and getting the big talent, then in a couple of years when these deals are in place, you're in position to benefit from them and therefore make back your money on the back end that you've spent right now, and hopefully you haven't just wasted for nothing. Now, when I say you gamble, admittedly, you are gambling with someone else's money, but you've also gambled away some of the equity in your company, which means you personally will make less money directly when you go ahead and get in that position, if you indeed do. You can no longer, if you're a traditional org, run your team like a business. Or you can run your team like a business, but if you do, you will fade away and die out. Or you will just not be a top-level organization. You won't be able to afford the biggest players and send them to all the biggest leagues, etc., or get all the best sponsors. It's already the case in CSGO that most North American organizations this year and for the past couple of years have not been paying close to these very inflated EU salaries you've heard about, because they were already paying a lot, and to the extent where they could barely justify it beyond that. And they weren't willing to take investment at the time. And they were trying to run their companies like businesses, and hence the TSMs of the world let organizations go that were elite teams like what became Astralis. It actually makes a lot of sense. Now, people seem to have no sympathy for these organizations, despite this very difficult plight I've listed before, where they're in a tough situation where there's not really an easy right answer, and making money isn't actually close to as possible as it was in the past. So what's weird is it seems that the lack of sympathy for the orgs comes on the basis of the fact that there are a bad few orgs out there that still remain to this day that don't do things the right way. So people act like all these organizations are just scumbags. And yet that hasn't been the case for a long while, that the top organizations were screwing people or angle shooting on them or mistreating them or making masses off them and then telling the players, oh, we can't pay you anymore, but just leveraging them and their inexperience and lack of business understanding to make massive amounts of money themselves. That hasn't been the case for a long time, especially not in CSGO and not in League of Legends either. And yet people act as if when these orgs say, we're having all these problems, we need revenue shares, we can't make money, that you should just say, oh, you can't stand the heat, get out the kitchen then. If you can't run your business in a way that makes money, just get out and let the others do it. What they don't seem to understand is we will be left in a much, much worse ecosystem if those traditional orgs leave. Because then the only people who will be able to afford and run teams will be the people who've brought in the outside investment and gambled away the present in search of a future that doesn't yet exist and may not yet exist, and they'll be the only people. And those people not only will have investors to answer to, but some of them have big orgs that have bought into them that give them some of this investment, and so they will then be run at a whim. So think about how you have TV shows that you saw that were very high quality or even had good ratings, and then suddenly out of nowhere they're cancelled. Because what happens is someone comes in and looks at the numbers and says, right, this show's doing well, but I wanted it to do better, so I'm just going to cancel it, not going to pay for next season. That doesn't matter how good it is. Or someone comes in and says, yeah, this show's doing well, it's a good show and the ratings are good. Oh, but I can actually put on a different show, say a reality TV show, for half the budget that'll get slightly more viewers. Well, fuck it, just cancel this one and put it over here. You know why the guy can do that? Because he only cares about the ratings and how much it costs. He doesn't care about the product. He doesn't care about esports and about the game and doesn't think there's inherent value in that. He just wants to make money and manipulate certain demographics and certain audiences. So in a world where that happens, esports could become massive, and it can also just be shut down in an instant, and it can be led astray, and it can be completely hoard out and market and strip mined of everything beneficial within it. And in no way will it be treated with any kind of reverence. Whereas some of these traditional orgs, as much as they want to make money and are willing to take investment and are willing to do some of these things that seem like business in that sense, a lot of those people are very genuine and do care about esports and sometimes support esports that aren't even the biggest ones, aren't even the best return on their money, because they actually believe in that esport and think it's important and want to give it time to develop, etc. So we won't have any of that if we let the money men come in and the accountants run everything, and it'll be a much worse world for everyone. And in fact, it will accelerate creating a bubble around esports that can burst and then set everyone back a few years again. Now, people also don't have sympathy for orgs in how they then give preferential treatment to the wants and whims of players, because they think they're just supporting the players, but sometimes they're supporting the players at the cost of the org. So they want players seemingly to be able to leave at a whim. Like if I'm someone who contracts a good player, a young player, and I'm a small org, and the player does really well, and then people come and say, oh, the top team comes and says, I don't want to just buy this player now. And I say, but I don't want to sell him. I mean, I found him, I've paid his salary, I've put him into the squad, he's doing very well. You know, my ideal scenario is to have a player doing very well, in fact, better than I thought he would be, who I have contracted, and I get to enjoy him for the rest of his contract. People will act as though the org is obliged to let that player go. In fact, they should, and in fact, they're somehow like, they're keeping him as a slave, or they've locked him up by not leaving him, letting him go. And yet that's the best case scenario for the org, the small org, is to have a player like that. Yeah, but they're not allowed to enjoy the benefits of that. And they sometimes even, fans want them to sell them at low cost prices, not even make a good amount from them, because fans want to see the player play in the big team. I understand the fans want to see that, but they're not being reasonable in how they frame it from the perspective of the smaller org. Then you've got the situation where even when contracts are in place and there's been massive investment from an org into players, they also, because they want a certain lineup to be made somewhere, they want the org to just let those players go. Even if you can't get anything good back in return and the money's not that great, just let them go to where they want to go, to where the players want to go, because players are very, very big influencers of fans at the moment. They have the most genuine voice, the most authentic voice to fans. And so if a player issues a concern like, oh, that we're being kept by this org and they're not treating us well, fans will just assume that's the case and they'll be against the org. And if the org tries to come out and in any way battle that, it's always a bad look for them. People also seemingly want all rights to go to the players. They want the ownership of major slots to go to players, the World Championship, which you build up for the whole year if you're a massive org and you put all your investment into. They want decisions over which leagues that players compete in to be on the backs of players, not the org that's paid all the money and has positioned themselves to get this team and makes the decisions of how things work and manages everything. They want the say over which tournaments the players attend to be for the players. So if the player goes, I'm a bit tired this month and a bit burned out, then he should just be able to cancel the last 2 events of the month, even though the org needed them to go there to meet a certain amount of hours and maybe to do some sponsor obligations there and to continually keep up exposure for their brands and certain numbers that they've promised to the sponsors, which allows them to get the money, which they then pay to the players as massive salaries. But the players, again, don't see how this food chain works. They want players to have all the say over roster decisions. So if they don't want to play with someone, or they do want to play with someone, they should have the say over what goes on there. Even though for the org, they're the one who's invested it all. It's their money that's being paid to get that player. They're the one whose future is being gambled. Largely, the player can go to a different org and change his future after his contract ends. But it's the brand that's being affected. And so if a deal is stupid or it's just over some petty issues, they would want like some say over that. People generally seem to want the players to have all the says over that. All the say over that. So CSGO right now is a terrible esport to make money in if you're an organization. Generally, it's not that great anyway because of how inflated it's got with the investment, but the orgs are the ones that are really suffering. And it is troubling to me because CSGO doesn't exist in isolation. There's a reason why there's orgs who exist in many different games, and multi-game orgs, nearly all of them. And that's because then they can pivot between the ones that it makes sense to invest more money in and to invest less money in, and they can keep teams within there so they have a foothold, but they can try and figure out where it makes the most sense to get a lot of success, to then sell to the sponsors, but also to be able to actually make money, to run a real business. And so CSGO's economy will not just affect only itself, it affects other games, and more importantly, it will be affected by the economies of other games. So in a world in which the Overwatch League is actually going to be franchised and people are buying in because they want these massive rev shares in the future, that will affect how much people are willing to invest in CSGO and which orgs remain in CSGO. Likewise, as the NALCS in League of Legends becomes franchised next year and people make rev share and they're already bought in and they've got a permanent place in the league and they can start to do more with their sponsor hours, etc. Now people will look on CSGO and say, is it really worth me having a top team in CSGO when I've got this team in the NALCS? So yes, the buy-in for these leagues is massive. So in a sense, you have to get investment anyway, but there is actually currently a much better chance and at least a visible obvious opportunity to make that money back in the future and to make real money and to make revenues which lead to good profit, not just making revenues back and trying to stay afloat and getting more investment and going in next year and doubling down and tripling down with the gambling like a lot of orgs are now. So yes, there are different scenarios and areas in which all areas of the pyramid are favored. But at the moment, the organizations, the teams, for my money, are the ones being screwed over the most. And yet they get the least sympathy of everyone, as far as I can tell, because the players within their teams always get the maximum treatment and benefit of the doubt from fans. And so since the dynamic goes, tournament organizers negotiate and battle with orgs to see who gets what share of the profit and how they are going to agree upon who attends their tournament. But the organizations, the teams, battle and negotiate with the players to see how much salary they're going to play and all this. And so since everyone's on the side of the players, they seem to automatically be against the organizations and want everything to go to the players without realizing if everything goes to the players, there's next to nothing left for the orgs. And since the tournament organizers are living large and sometimes even like the Weezer thing, manipulating the players against the orgs are the ones actually left on the outside getting fucked over. And so it's actually a very difficult situation where regardless of how you feel, I would hope people at least understand some of the dynamics and have a little bit more sympathy for these organizations, which are key, integral foundational elements within esports and our ecosystem.